Hey, what's up, everybody? Good morning. I hope that you're doing well and you had a good week. It's good to see a few of you saying hello in the chat. Welcome back. Um, we've been doing a lot of different reading in this class. You maybe have noticed that we began with some interesting conceptual reading from Sen. Then we had a reading from Tadaro and Smith, who are economists. And then we read Jared Diamond, who wrote in a much more interesting way about geography. And these different readings are interesting because even though they really give you a nice diversity and a range of flavors, they address a lot of the same questions ultimately. And these questions relate to, of course, development and what drives it and what inhibits it. So we will discuss geography today, and we will ultimately bring in Diamond, but we'll get started by kind of summing up the main implications of the complementarity and coordination-based models, those contemporary theories of development that we read about in tandem with the classic theories of development. So we will be addressing geography. As you'll see, we'll sort of deal with geography more quickly because some of those arguments can be summarized quite neatly. And we'll eventually be using some methods today to address some of these questions that come up and see what we can conclude in an actual analysis. Now, as you know, today I'm going to be posting the problem set, the first assignment. Now, I'll be posting that later by 5 p.m., and you'll have a full week to complete that. You just need to finish that up and submit that under the assignments tab on CAD courses. I will go ahead and email you the assignment directly, and I'll post it on CAD courses as well. But you'll have a full week and, of course, access to all the materials and the readings, the lectures. I'll make sure everything is updated and posted for you so that you'll have all that material. But without further ado, let's get started. So we gave you some different examples of coordination problems. One of them was the basic problem that most developing countries encounter, which is you need people to invest money in your economy and build factories and set up productive activities. But in order for them to do that, there needs to be an abundance of skilled labor or human capital that can be used to actually produce the goods that would be produced in that factory. But those skilled workers themselves are unlikely to upskill or prepare themselves or get ready for such employment without the investment in that factory in the first place. And so there's a coordination problem and a lack of fit. Government enters the picture when government creates incentives or creates policies intended to stimulate investment, upskilling, the sorts of activities and the sorts of changes that would be necessary to get the parts working together and fitting well together in a way that we would refer to as complementary. That's the idea of a complementarity, as we saw. We also saw the example of specialized agricultural markets where you need both middlemen and the producers themselves. But middlemen are unlikely to emerge unless there's a wide variety of different commodities being produced. But farmers and producers are unlikely to produce a wide variety of commodities unless the middlemen exist in the first place. It's a coordination problem. So specialized agricultural markets require the intervention of government and specific policies designed to try to stimulate the formation of specialized agriculture, and then also those middlemen who function to connect producers to consumers. These are two basic examples. The basic notion of these models is that development or underdevelopment depends on solving or failing to solve these problems of coordination. Where countries successfully resolve these issues, they develop. Where they do not resolve these issues, they do not develop. And what's so important about these theories is that they imply that there must be a conscious, active effort on the part of government and public authorities to set up institutions and set up policies that resolve these coordination problems, and not just passively or indirectly or effectively, but intentionally, deliberately so. This requires an activist government, a sort of activist state. Quite in contrast to the neoliberal model, this vision of the world really implies a pretty substantial and active and clever and sophisticated role for the state in setting up institutions, those rules and constraints, those arrangements that will support the kinds of complementary activities that are necessary to develop the economy. So market incentives play an important role. And these are, of course, created with public authority. And when we say public authority, we're referring to the state and government in the way that authority is used to intervene in markets to create all sorts of incentives that might promote the development of or the acquisition of skills among workers or investment by foreign investors or domestic investors and so on and so forth. Now, we're going to take a look at an example that is a really good example of how governments play an active role in resolving these coordination problems, and specifically through the creation of incentives that are designed to goad and sort of lure in investment and simultaneously promote the acquisition of skills among workers. It's a very, very important role for the state. China exhibits this perhaps more than any other case because of its rapid growth. So our starting point with this example is that between 1978 and 2008, China grew at an extraordinary rate, 9% growth per year. GDP per capita was 5 times that of the 1978 levels by 2008. It was an extraordinarily fast process. And the question, why, is the relevant question, especially when some of those earlier models of development, like the Rostow model, anticipated that this process takes several decades and possibly more than a century. Clearly, in both China and South Korea and other Southeast Asian countries, it happened much more quickly. When you begin to consider coordination and incentives and the role of the state, we begin to better understand the pace and the scope of growth. And in particular, in China, those incentives came in the form of special economic zones and open door policies. But not just special economic zones or EPZs anywhere, but in particular in places, in regions in China that were not as encumbered by the legacies of existing institutions. And so remember that China had a centrally planned economy and essentially a communist state. And this meant that there was an extensive buildup of institutions and organizations that had been involved in everything under the umbrella of centrally planning the economy. Some areas, however, were more entrenched in that model than others. And so when China set out on this path of creating incentives or setting up systems to try to resolve coordination problems, it made sense to try to set up those systems in places that would be less bound or sort of less entrenched in those earlier institutions. But it wasn't just that. It was also the case that Chinese officials and decision makers sought to concentrate these special economic zones in places where there were existing human capital resources and infrastructure, and where they could develop further and incentivize the further development of that human capital and further growth of expertise. So what you have is you have incentives luring in investment into special economic zones, and you have government efforts to promote human capital and skill acquisition in the same area in places that are less entrenched in those original communist economic institutions. And the result, from the perspective of the coordination-based models, is growth. This is a classic example of public policy and state intervention targeted at creating complementarities where they don't previously exist, and specifically doing so in an area where there is not an extensive institutional legacy. When you think about the regional distribution of power, and especially in a large country like China, it makes sense that not all areas may be equally entrenched in those old institutions. And so when you put this all together, complementarities and coordination and incentives in less institutionally entrenched areas equals growth, especially when the state can simultaneously promote improvements in human capital and skill acquisition, the growth of expertise, etc. Classic example. Let's watch a video that helps to put this in perspective.
I'm here in Shenzhen, actually on a government organized tour to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the opening of Shenzhen Special Economic Zones. My first stop is here at the Mawan port. It's basically a traditional seaport, but they're transforming it into what's called a smart port. And they're doing that by deploying Huawei's 5G, as well as using Tencent's cloud computing. One thing I've noticed around here is that there are not a lot of people, just because everything is automated. They're also using green technology, as well as Beidou, which is the Chinese equivalent of GPS. I'm over here in Qianhai, which is an area in Shenzhen that the government is developing in order to better integrate the city and Hong Kong, Zhuhai. It's all part of plans for the Greater Bay Area. It's sort of like, imagine Wall Street and San Francisco's famous Fisherman's Wharf. They're trying to lure a lot of companies and talent to come to this area by offering a lot of tax incentives. One way of looking at Qianhai is it's China's big bet that this is going to be the new economic model driving the country going forward. I'm in front of Tencent headquarters. The most interesting thing about Tencent was actually its exhibition hall. It's been like a science and technology museum, but with sort of Disneyland type interactive elements. This is the last stop on my whirlwind tour of Shenzhen, and I'm here at the Ping An Finance Building. It's the second tallest building in China. This is the view of the Ping An Building from the 116th floor, overlooking Shenzhen.
So there you have it. There's an extensive role for the government in creating incentives and trying to lure both investment, talent. Even in the case of Shenzhen, which is sort of China's Silicon Valley, where fewer and fewer actual people are working, there's still a very deliberate effort to bring investment and foster skill acquisition in that area. And really viewed from the perspective of productivity, it makes sense that even in a special economic zone, the government would be involved in trying to increase productivity. And frankly, that often does mean new technology, fewer workers, but specifically so that new gains can be reinvested elsewhere in the economy and used to develop maybe that area further or some other part of the economy. It's important to remember that China still remains very much a mixed economy. And so although there is an important role for the state in promoting this kind of arrangement, it's not an entirely liberalized model. But nevertheless, this is a really interesting example of how much of a role for the state there is under these kinds of circumstances. So now we're going to switch to the geography hypothesis. As you know, this first part of the class focuses on patterns and concepts, the empirical record, and different theoretical perspectives on development, ways of understanding variations in development. And one of the oldest models, or one of the oldest theories, actually emphasizes geography and goes back all the way to Montague, who was this French, sort of philosopher thinker who had a lot to say about the ethics and the habits and the morality and the behavior of people. And how that relates to geography is an interesting question, but you'll soon see that there are some ideas that are quite old and quite entrenched in the discourse about how geography can affect work ethic and thought patterns and cognition in a very interesting but controversial way when we think more about some of the way we understand a lot of these issues today. So there are a lot of variants and subvariants. In the first place, the climate hypothesis can be thought of in terms of the old version and the modern version. Then there's the ecology hypothesis, which is really just one version. And both of these, as you'll see, have in common that they explain divisions between rich and poor countries by emphasizing geographical differences and differences in their characteristics geographically that in particular would or might affect productivity, which is usually considered to be the proximate cause of underdevelopment, low productivity. But let's get into some more detail and take a look at the climate hypothesis. So the climate hypothesis really emerged from this observation that many have had over generations, centuries, that many poor countries, such as those in Africa, Central America, and South Asia, are arid and or between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. So they're hot climates. They're hot climates as opposed to temperate climates, which disproportionately appear to be those nations that are also quite rich. And this distinction is one that's often been invoked when people talk about the tendency that they claim exists among people in hot climates to be lazy and have a poor work ethic, or to be affected by the hot climate. The idea was, according to Montague and according to some who've recycled the logic since, the heat and the humidity can be harmful to productivity. It is interesting to note that air conditioning has been shown to improve and increase productivity pretty substantially. That's an interesting feature. I don't know if the logic is analogous to countries as a whole. And in fact, what's noteworthy or problematic about this thesis is that in pre-modern times, Central American countries were some of the richest and most advanced civilizations on Earth, or at least present day Central American countries. Civilizations like the Aztecs and others had writing systems and were rich and opulent and couldn't be considered by any stretch to have been underdeveloped relative to their peers. And so this idea that the climate is really the root cause of development or underdevelopment doesn't travel well beyond the modern era. And in particular, it can also be refuted if you just look at some exceptional examples today. And we'll see maybe some of those examples in a moment. But the modern version of this hypothesis doesn't focus on supposed tendencies of laziness that result from hot weather. It focuses instead on more benign and maybe more logical claims about tropical diseases like malaria that harm health and labor productivity, tropical soils that are less conducive to agriculture. These sorts of arguments that relate more to features of the geography that don't emphasize the climate and really talk more about the structural features and the features that might inhibit productivity and also affect health. This version, of course, is more palatable. It's emphasized and talked about by economists like Jeffrey Sachs and others who insist that there is a geographical component. What we're going to do, though, is we're going to see for ourselves whether or not this argument travels well. And we'll specifically look at this climate hypothesis. And we'll take a look at how it pairs with some other hypotheses that might also stand to explain development or underdevelopment. So we'll use the method of agreement in particular because we didn't use the method of agreement yet. We've been using the method of difference. So the method of agreement, as you'll recall, involves comparing different cases. And we're going to review this briefly so that we're on the same page and so that we remember and can recall what we've learned so far about this already. But this will be the first time we've actually used this in practice. So when we use the method of agreement, we're comparing sets of very different cases where the outcome does not vary. These are countries that have the same value on the dependent variable, but that differ in terms of their social, political, economic, historical, geographic, and other circumstances. And the idea is that we identify the outcome to be explained, and then we try to identify what factor these very different cases have in common, despite all of those other differences. And then we investigate or maybe suggest that this key factor is related to the outcome. So we're basically picking very different countries that align and agree in terms of the outcome so that we can study them for clues as to why they agree. And that clue that we ultimately point to has to be the same in both cases, because that would be the only way that it could explain the similarity in the outcome, despite all the other differences. And so before we continue and before we use this, can I clarify anything about this method? Because the logic is a little bit different than the method of difference. We will use this and apply this, but do we have any questions about the method of agreement before we continue? All right, clear as mud. Let's do this. So here's our puzzle. We've got two countries, Botswana and Malaysia. Both of these countries developed very, very rapidly in recent decades. This is despite the fact that relatively recently they were both considered poor countries and quite poor. In fact, Botswana was the poorest country in Africa in the 1960s, and it's now one of the richest. Malaysia traditionally was a poor country as well, and today it's not an upper income country, but an upper middle income country. Today, they're both outstanding examples of development in their respective regions, and so it's interesting to consider what potential role there might be for climate. But before we get there, let's identify some key differences between them that we can rule out as potential explanations for their rapid development in recent decades. So in the first place, Botswana is a democracy and Malaysia is essentially an electoral dictatorship. Now, it's sort of a mixed bag because Botswana has been under one-party rule for some time, but Freedom House scores Botswana as mostly free and Malaysia as less so. And so what we can conclude is that political institutions vary between these two countries. They're not really the same. So we can identify that as a variable that we can rule out. Similarly, the coastal or landlocked geography of these countries also distinguishes them. So Botswana is landlocked in the middle of Africa, no access to the ocean, in a continent that's quite large and that requires a great deal of travel to get to the nearest point. if you're leaving Botswana. Malaysia, by contrast, is coastal. It's actually peninsular. It's got water on most sides. And so clearly this geography, if we're thinking about access, for example, or transportation or connectedness to global markets, this obviously differentiates them too. This is noteworthy. And then third, population. Malaysia has 32 million people. Botswana has 2 million people. The size of their domestic markets, therefore, very, very different. Malaysia is huge compared to Botswana. So we can rule out population, geography, and political institutions as variables that potentially explain the variation in development outcome. What we can say then is it can't be these variables. What we'll do is we'll focus on 3 hypotheses. These 3 hypotheses all have some basis in the literature and could potentially explain their similar development outcome. And I said variation in development outcome. I apologize. They have the same development outcome. We're using the method of agreement, not method of difference. So these 3 hypotheses start with colonial legacy. They both have a British colonial legacy because Great Britain imposed what are called liberal colonial institutions. Many argue that a British colonial legacy should correlate with long-term economic development because those liberal institutions tend to promote growth and widespread and relatively egalitarian participation in politics and the economy. Both Malaysia and Botswana have this British colonial legacy. They were both British colonies. Therefore, we might hypothesize that this legacy should drive development. Our second hypothesis has to do with climate. And this, excuse me, hold on. This is really important. I need to change something real quick. Underdevelopment, there. I had the wrong. Okay, so the climate hypothesis, remember it says that temperate climates or hot climates, or excuse me, hot as in arid or tropical, temperate is colder or more moderate, but arid or tropical climates should be correlated with underdevelopment because they undermine or they reduce agricultural productivity, and because they supposedly, according to the older argument, affect work ethic and thought patterns and cognition. Now, even if we dispense with the old argument, the new version of the climate hypothesis still claims that hot weather and hot climates should correlate with underdevelopment. And then there's a third variable we'll consider too, and that's the state buildup variable. This is basically the extent to which the country has engaged in a thoroughgoing state reform that's designed to strengthen state bureaucracies and executive bureaucracies that form and implement economic policy and that maybe promote development or social or political or economic objectives. Some states have engaged in this thoroughgoing reform and others have not. And we might hypothesize that those states that have built up their states in their executive bureaucracies should be more likely to develop since those organizations promote development as their core function. So these will be the 3 hypotheses that we test. And what we'll do is we'll look at Botswana and Malaysia and we'll look at their values on those 3 hypotheses. And we'll see what we can conclude using the method of agreement to analyze them. So this is the setup. We've got our 2 cases here. We've got British colonial legacy here, climate here, state buildup here, and then our dependent variable, the development outcome. And we've got our values on these variables. Now, as before, we ask ourselves a question about this information. But in this case, because we're using the method of agreement, we don't ask how do these cases differ. We ask how do these cases agree. And specifically, we say, how do these different cases agree? What is it that they have in common that could explain their similar outcome? And then in turn, what inferences can we draw from the info regarding the role of these different variables in shaping development? Now, this is actual information. This is not hypothetical. These are the values that these countries take on these three variables, and these are the values on the dependent variable. So take a few moments and answer these questions for yourself, and then tell me in a private message using the chat your responses. It doesn't need to be very long. Just tell me your responses in that private message, and then we'll work together as a class to do this, and we'll discuss the answers. Keep them coming, everybody. I'm doing my best to respond individually when you chat me. So we will take a moment to do this, and I want to have a chance to interact with you if I can. So explain me or just give me your responses in a private message. Yes, Ernie, that's what I mean. How are they similar? We say agree because that's the language that we often use when we talk about these methods. Good, Rady. So this is an interesting problem because, as many of you notice, they agree in all three variables. But there's more to it than that, right? Just because they agree in all three doesn't mean that all three of them can be connected or linked to the outcome, because there's one more piece of information that matters, which is, does the variable perform in the way that we expected it to perform? Is the direction is the relationship the expected relationship? And if it's not the expected relationship, well, then we can actually rule out that variable, or we can at least conclude that it doesn't appear to be connected to the outcome, even if our two cases agree on that variable. And so we need to see if they agree and if they're similar, but we also need to know if the variable is performing the way we expect it to, if the relationship between it and the development outcome is the relationship that we expected to find. And so that's something that we need to be thinking about. And as many of you are pointing out, when you consider that, it undermines one of the hypotheses here in this data. And that's the important point that we'll hone in on here in a minute as many of us continue to work through this. And I'm seeing that there's a lot of agreement here among students who are messaging me directly about what might have played a role and what might not have, based on whether those relationships are performing as expected and whether there's agreement in those key variables. And so let's do this then. First, we ask, in what ways do these different cases agree? As you point out, everyone, they agree in all ways. All three of the variables, British colonial legacy, climate, and state buildup, exhibit the same value for Botswana in Malaysia. Notice, yes, yes, hot, hot, yes, yes. So that is interesting and noteworthy, right? But notice that only state buildup in British colonial legacy perform as expected. Only these two variables exhibit the relationship with development outcome that we expected to find based on our theoretical expectations that we started this analysis with. So what we can say is that climate, hot climate, does not appear to cause underdevelopment, because if hot climate caused underdevelopment, we would not see advance to upper and middle income. We would see continuation of lower income status. These countries advanced to upper middle income status despite having a hot climate. And so we can rule out the climate hypothesis and say, based on these cases, that that variable does not cause and determine the long-term development outcome, because if it did, Botswana and Malaysia would not have advanced to upper middle income status. On the other hand, there appears to be some evidence or some role for British colonial legacy and a state buildup or a bureaucratic sort of reform, because they both register yes on these variables, and these relationships conform to our expectations. We expect to find that a British colonial legacy will leave behind liberal institutions that tend to promote growth over time. We expect to find that a state buildup will help to promote development by better allocating and more decisively allocating resources, promoting development, and helping to support and incentivize investments, so on and so forth. What we can suggest is that climate does not appear to cause development. What does appear, or what may cause development, is a British colonial legacy and a state building moment that involves expanding and strengthening the bureaucracy. This is really neat because it shows us that climate, though an attractive explanation for underdevelopment, does not doom countries to underdevelopment and does not necessarily prevent them from growing relatively quickly, not just over the long term. Now, there's another hypothesis that I already mentioned, and this gets us to the Jared Diamond reading. This is a neat reading because Diamond is writing about periods of time that precede the modern period, but that, according to him, set in motion this sort of historical process or set of historical endowments that would in turn shape the long-term development trajectory. And so, according to Diamond and according to the ecology hypothesis, the origins of inequality at the beginning of the modern period were different historical endowments of plant and animal species. And the reason this was so important, Diamond says, is because endowments of domesticatable species made it possible to commercialize and specialize in agriculture and produce more, develop writing systems, enhance and increase agricultural productivity, and eventually make transitions to economies that would be more industrialized. He doesn't talk about that late era, in that late modern era, but he's concerned with this historical moment that he claims and argues is essential to understanding the long-term trajectory of countries. So according to him, some places like the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East had many domesticatable species, and others in the Americas did not. And according to Diamond, these different endowments shaped productivity in writing systems. And it was this process that is at the root of development outcomes. This is the ecology hypothesis. This is obviously different than the climate hypothesis, but it still emphasizes differences in geographical features and uses those to explain differences in development. This is the conclusion of our study of geography. And before we go, I just want to pause and open it up to anyone who has a comment or a question about the geography hypothesis and how geography has been used or is used to explain underdevelopment. Is anyone especially persuaded, or does anyone believe that it's just a convenient tool and that there might be more to the story? Or do we just have any comments or questions?
I didn't really understand the part where it said that the Europeans that they didn't take their own domesticated species, but they used local domesticated species, right? I didn't really understand that part.
Can you point me to the place in the reading where you saw that?
It was towards the end, I believe in around 105, 106.
Okay. So are you talking about how he's referring to how it wasn't a conscious choice and it evolved as a byproduct?
Yeah.
So I just think that what he means is that it wasn't an intentional policy or goal, but people had to feed themselves. And so where they had more to work with in that regard, they were able to specialize and develop agricultural production beyond where places had less to work with. And what he means is domesticatable species, animals, plants. And after all, that is what we think about when we refer to food production and what we produce and what we eat. So I think he just means that as humans, we're not necessarily thinking first about commercial food production, but we're thinking about feeding ourselves, and we'll use what we need and what we can find to feed ourselves. And where we have access to more plants and more animals and more species, we'll domesticate them, and we'll do that in the process of feeding ourselves. And in the process, we'll also develop commercial and more productive agriculture. I think that's what he means when he refers to that. Listen, everybody, we're out of time, and this has been very useful. As I said, I'll be posting the homework assignment by 5 p.m. Pacific time, and you'll have a full week to do that. And I'll make sure that everything is posted as well. But thanks so much for being here today, and I hope this was useful for you. I'll see you on Monday, and have a wonderful weekend.